Hey everyone, Phobos here, coming at you with another build guide, and this time it's for the Freezing Pulse Totem Inquisitor, and this is the third Freezing Pulse Totem build on my channel. If you've been following for a while, you've probably seen the Elementalist as well as the Hierophant, and I'll say right now that if you're planning on doing one of these builds next league, I would definitely check out the other two. So even if you just see this guide and you like this particular version, I would definitely check out the other two because they're slightly different play styles, and you may end up liking one of those more. So definitely take a look at those. Um, this was originally the Ascendancy that I was going to pick, the Inquisitor, and I thought it made a lot of sense because of the Inevitable Judgment node, which basically takes monsters' resistances to 0. But then I started to play around with getting the monsters in the far, far negative resist, and that's kind of how the Elementalist one was spawned, and then the Elementalist did a great job of that, but it was a little bit squishy, so I decided to make the Hierophant, so that's kind of like the tankier version. So the Hierophant is probably the least damage. Elementalist and this are probably the most damage. It's kind of hard to really pick which one does more damage, but both of these are a little bit squishier. So it's definitely worth checking out all three. But for right now, I'll just go into the mechanics behind the Inquisitor and all the gear and stuff like that. So obviously, like I said, the goal here was to not rely on bringing stuff negative and just taking away the resistances of the mob, which means that we're going to be trying to get damage in other places. So I'll just bring up the items here. We're using the Soul Mantle in this case, and if you're unfamiliar with the Soul Mantle, it basically just gives you an extra totem, some totem life, some spell damage. And the main reason why we're using it is because it gives you an extra damage link on the spell totem. And that's going to be critical to freezing everything in the game that can be frozen, which is what the goal of this build is to do, because we're just getting more damage out of our skill, because we don't have to put the spell totem gem inside of a 6 link or something like that. We have it implicit. Now, as you can see, it does give us a nasty side effect. Inflicts a random 20 curse on your totem, on you when your totems die. Now, the problem with this is that it's not just when the totems die, but it's also when they go away as well. So if you see, I have my 3 totems, which is the cap, and then I put one out and it removes the other totem, and it gives me a curse. So this is very dangerous. As you can see, they can stack up pretty quickly. But the way that we handle this is basically just with warding flasks. Now, in the other two builds, I had 2 warding flasks, which were the Quicksilver and the Basalt. They both had duration on them. And that works out just fine in pretty much all cases. But for this build, I decided to try to use just a normal sulfur flask instead of Sorrow of the Divine. So I had used Sorrow of the Divine because initially I thought that the life regen that I had would probably be better off going on my ES. But after playtesting all 3 versions of the build, I actually decided that I like it more when it just regens my life, because if I take a little bit of chaos damage or something like that, I don't have to pop a health flask. I'm regenning fairly fine. And putting it on the ES isn't really a big deal. And if I don't have to put it on the ES, then I can just run another warding flask and be extra safe. And most of the time, you're not going to need to run uh, you're not going to need all of this warding. So if you wanted, you could actually probably run just the Basalt and the Sulfur, and then you could put like movement speed on the Quicksilver or something like that. So you can mess around with this a bit. But the idea is that in extended boss fights, where there's sometimes scarce adds, like Core Malachi is a great example of this, you have a lot of warding basically, as long as you manage your flask properly. And that's something that the other builds were lacking a little bit. You kind of had to really hit your timings well to get through those fights safely. So I definitely would recommend in a sulfur flask with warding on it, because it has basically 3 uses and you can get a large amount of time out of it. And then basically just using instant recovery flasks for freeze and bleed for the life flasks. So getting into the other gear, we have Winds of Change gauntlets, pretty self-explanatory, projectile damage, and most importantly, projectile speed. Freeze Pulse has pretty decent projectile speed when you have a 20 quality gem, but it's not the best, and we always want more because, as you know, with projectile speed and Freezing Pulse, your Freezing Pulse does more damage to the mobs that are closer to it, and when you extend that range, you're basically doing more damage for a longer period of time. So these gauntlets are great because they have the life as well. The only negative thing is the 10% reduced movement speed. Which brings us to our boots. These boots are less than ideal, but the concept behind them is good. So basically, if you can, I would try and get this lab enchant, 120% increased critical strike chance if you haven't crit recently. There's other versions of this. I believe this is the highest one that you can get, but it's incredibly strong. It's actually stronger on the Hierophant version because it's pretty much up 100% of the time because you're never using Orb of Storms. Because you generate power charges when your totems kill things. However, it's still very strong for this build, and in this case, basically, I bought the boots and tried to craft them, and if you're going to craft them, I think the best essence would probably be the movement speed one, because the movement speed is pretty much the most imperative stat. But unfortunately, I ran out of movement speed essences after wasting probably about 20 of them and getting absolute garbage, so I decided to throw a few alchs in. I was pretty frustrated. I ended up getting these boots right here, and they were kind of just good enough where I could make them work because I really needed the resist. So I just crafted some movement speed on there for testing. And yeah, as you'll see in some of the video content that comes out, definitely not the fastest, definitely not ideal. Probably would not settle for these in a league. But it's just for testing purposes, and if you can get these with a decent movement speed, decent life, and some good resists, they're going to do wonders for you in terms of DPS. It's basically just free crit. So definitely would recommend that. As for the belt, pretty much just life and resist. With flask effect duration, just really helps out to keep all your wardings up and stuff like that. On the rings, basically looking for mana and mana regen with life and some resistances. It's more important on this version than the Hierophant version because the Hierophant version has all the mana reduction for the cost of skills, and then on top of that, you get more mana from Hierophant anyways. So this, you're cutting it a little bit closer and you have to use Clarity. In most cases, I would say. So it's kind of important to get those rolls on your rings. This roll is not optimized. Probably should have an energy shield % roll on here. Neck is just damage because I had enough space to get damage on it because my resists were showed up elsewhere. If you need resists on it, though, feel free to get it there. As for the helm, the 30% increased freezing pulse projectile speed. Now, the damage one is probably technically better, but the projectile speed is great quality of life, and at the time, I was having trouble acquiring a hubris that was basically not already rolled a CI and had the damage enchant on it. So I would say it's not really bad to go for freezing pulse projectile speed or the damage. It's kind of like up to you, depends on what you need more. If you're having trouble freezing, definitely go for the damage. And that's why we take the damage generally over the cast speed, as the cast speed will probably provide more DPS, but the damage is what helps you freeze targets. And the idea is that we want to be freezing targets even in unfavorable circumstances with things like Enfeeble or Equilibrium. Equilibrium doesn't really affect this build as much, but it affects the other builds. So yeah, that's pretty much the thought process behind that. Now, as for our wands, using 2 void batteries here. Initially, I wasn't a fan of using the void batteries because, especially in this build, because relying on the power charges just sucks. But I found a couple ways to get around it, and I feel pretty good about it. My main issue is that I didn't really like using Orb of Storms in some circumstances because it felt very dangerous in very high level maps where the mobs just do a ton of damage, and you don't want to put yourself in a compromising position just to generate some power charges, which is why these were great on the Hierophant, because the Hierophant generates charges just by killing things with the totems, but in this case, you don't have a mechanic like that, so you pretty much need to rely on the Orb of Storms at some times. But in order to help with the Orb of Storms and to make everything a lot safer, which is why I was ultimately fine using the Void Batteries, we have the weapon swap. And when you swap weapons, you have the Jaws of Agony and the Storm Prism Wand. Now, the Jaws of Agony are basically there to generate you power charges. So you go into the map, you have this shield, it's a 25% chance to gain a power charge when throwing a trap. You link it with multiple trap support, fire trap, and then cluster trap, and you're throwing down a bunch of traps, and you have a 25% chance to generate a power charge on each individual trap. So you basically just spam the shit out of this, and if you need to, I have fire traps in there, so if you don't get it on the first round, you don't have to wait for the bear traps to all recharge. And we're at 8 power charges. The reason why we're at 8 is because we don't have both void batteries in, and that's why we use the storm prism, because otherwise we'd be at 7. So we're as close as we can possibly get to max charges here, and it works out pretty good, because normally what you do is you just generate your charges, you swap back, and then use Orb of Storms to get your 9th charge, and then you can pretty much use Orb of Storms in a lot of situations and be absolutely fine, and you can keep your 9 charges. But if there's situations where you think that it's kind of like a danger to go in and things are very sketchy, just swap right back and throw a couple of these down, and you'll probably get some power charges, and that'll reset the whole stack. So don't wait until it's like a second or so, but 2 to 3 seconds out is normally fine. In the next league, I believe it's 2.6, there's going to be a shield coming out that basically gives you 2 power charges when you use a Warcry, and that's going to be, in my opinion, much better than this shield. Obviously, you have the potential of getting stuff insanely quick like this, so this would be good to start the map still. But the other shield on Warcry is going to guaranteed give you 2 charges, so it's going to always refresh your stack, and I think it's kind of just going to be a superior option to the shield. But right now, this works great. And if that shield ends up being expensive, this still works fine as a budget option. So just something to keep in mind. And you'll see this come into play in the videos that I'll be posting as well. So let me go back here. Okay, let's talk about the damage a bit. So in town, we have 50k tooltip, and that is with increased critical strike support, increased critical damage, controlled destruction, freezing pulse, minion and totem elemental resist, and faster casting. Now you're probably wondering about this one. It seems a little bit out of place. In the Hierophant version and the Elementalist use Cold Pen, and I initially had a green link, so I tried out added cold, and it definitely added, I think, about like 4 to 5k more damage to the setup. So it is a stronger damage gem. However, this gives almost the same damage, and it also gives the 44% to all res to the totem, which makes your totems noticeably tankier. They're definitely tankier against normal mobs. You can tell anything that does elemental damage basically, and they're much tankier against reflect. And it doesn't seem like a lot, but your totem surviving even like 1 extra round of damage from mobs is crucial, because as long as your totem gets a pulse, it will freeze everything on the screen. With all your charges up, you have 95% crit, so you will freeze the enemy mobs, unless you have that map mod, which you should never run, at least in red maps when it's super high and they're sketchy, which is that reduces the effectiveness of like your status ailments that you're putting, or not reduces the effectiveness, but reduces the chance that they'll get put on. So stay away from that map mod, but otherwise you're freezing everything. So you just need to make sure that your totems get a shot out, and then they will continue to do damage, no matter how chunked out they are. So this gem is super, super awesome, and it's worth its weight in gold, in my opinion. I would definitely take it over added cold, even though it's so tempting to want to put added cold in there for sure. I understand the temptation. And moving on to the actual damage, so it's 50k in town. When you have all your charges up, and you have the 120 crit from this because you haven't crit recently, it's like 190k. And then when you pop your sulfur flask, you hit 201k or something like that, 204k. And you're 174k when you have all your charges, but you don't have this up. And I believe you're like 180 when you don't have this up and you have your flask up, or something like that with all your charges. So the damage is definitely there. Significantly more tooltip than the other builds, but keep in mind they're using Cold Pen, so you have to take that into account. Yeah, so that's pretty much the DPS. Let's get into the actual tree a bit here. So we take inevitable judgments, obviously, because the whole point of this is to ignore the resistances. Righteous Providence is great because even when you don't have your crit from the boots, your first hit is pretty much always going to be a crit because you're getting the 100% increased critical strike chance against enemies that are affected by no status ailments. So they're obviously not affected by anything before you hit them, so you're getting that crit for sure. And then once you do hit something, you're getting the 45% crit multi against it, which is a insane damage boost. And then for our second point, we're getting the this node right here. Take 16% more elemental damage, or enemies take 16% more elemental damage. Really helps out with your freezing, and you take 8% less elemental damage, which is great as well. And then the Uber points will go to Instruments of Virtue. So in terms of deciding like where you want your Uber points to go, if you're looking for clear speed, Instruments of Virtue is way better, especially if you go like Scepter Shield combo or Dagger shield combo, because you don't have to run the void batteries. Keep that in mind. They're not required for the build or anything like that. And you can always run like you could run a void battery and a shield, but then you won't be able to use shield charge. So if you're trying to benefit from the whirling blades or the shield charge, you would have to use a dagger or a scepter. But if you're trying to do that and you're trying to move to the map extremely fast, Instruments of Virtue is going to be your go-to for the Merciless point. But in this case, I was mostly just looking to freeze things and really get that freeze on bosses. And if you're trying to do that, then going this route is far better. And you can always pick up this stuff with the Uber points. And even if you want to use the Void Batteries, you can always throw in an attack. I'm not really sure which one I would do yet. I would love to get Uber on this, but I had to rip the character. This character was already ripped, but I was able to take advantage of a Soul Mantle. This is actually a completely different character, and I kind of respect it. I've had this character for like 2 leagues, so I was only able to get the Soul Mantle though on softcore, and on softcore I don't have my Uber lab completed, and it's kind of a pain in the ass fishing for the challenges and stuff. So that's why I don't have the points. But yeah, this is definitely worth picking up. This is one of those ascendancies where getting the 8 points is definitely something you want because they're all pretty much beneficial. Um, let's go to the actual tree now. So pretty standard tree. It's actually very similar to the other trees that the other trees that you've probably seen if you looked at the guys. I'm pretty sure it's actually exactly the same, except I take mine over matter here. Let me put on the auras and stuff. So when we have discipline is what we use discipline and clarity, and I believe that's it. Yep, and then the lightning golem for the cast speed. You could also use the fire golem if you want, if you're having trouble freezing things. Another damage boost never hurts. The discipline, basically just to give us a nice chunk of energy shield, makes the build relatively tanky when combined with the mind over matter. Not too much mana for the mind over matter, but keep in mind that the totems don't cost that much, right? They cost like 116, and we have a decent amount of mana regen. So we're not really screwed if we take a big hit because we get mana back relatively fast, especially because we have a clarity in there. Something you can also do if you want is you can use a blasphemy temp chains, and if you do that, what I would recommend is you could do it with the mind over matter, but I think at that point you are definitely really cutting into your mana and you're really going to yourself. So what I would do is I would just remove the mind over matter and add the blasphemy in. And I think you end up with like 250 to 300 mana or something like that, and it's plenty to cast. It's plenty to cast like all your totems and stuff. You'll be absolutely fine. The reason why I don't use temp chains is because I find that the build ends up killing stuff that's like outside of the range of the blasphemy, and I think that has a lot to do with the fact that because it's a projectile based build, you're not getting as many area nodes and stuff like that. So you can try it out, and if your experience differs, go ahead and use blasphemy with temporal chains. Temporal chains is a great curse, and it will help with your freeze duration, but ultimately I just found that it wasn't really something that I needed to have on Blasphemy because of how my totems were doing damage most of the time. Still a great curse to use on bosses, though, to help with your freeze duration. But basically, as long as you can get a freeze on the boss, then Temporal Change will help you keep the freeze on the boss. And with this build, you're not going to be using a Frostbite or anything like that, so just something to keep in mind. And then we have the Orb of Storms. I have an Ice Spear in here too, but you don't really need that. I was kind of messing around with what options felt good, and I definitely prefer the Orb of Storms for sure. I have the Discipline linked to it. 3 Enlighten. You may have to cut back on one aura, basically de-level your clarity a bit if you're not using a level 3 Enlighten. I had this lying around, so that's why I decided to use it. Make sure you have a Vol Lightning Trap as well. Vol Lightning Trap is going to be the key to freezing things if you're low geared. So if you have bad wands, if you have a 5-link Soul Mantle, for example, or something like that, Vol Lightning Trap is your best friend. I would say, though, if you have good wands and a 5-link Soul Mantle, you'll pretty much be able to freeze anything without it. I can easily freeze anything without it, even with bad mods, given the 6-link. But when you do have the 50% more damage from the shock, it just makes everything so much easier. So definitely look into a Vol Lightning Trap and link it to duration, and I have it linked with the cast on damage taken as well, Immortal Call. So yeah, that's pretty much that. And then Orb of Storms I have with AoE and Power Charge on crit. I'm probably going to put this back in the helm too and use throw either crit on there or faster casting, because I think this setup is just kind of useless. And then I use Flame Dash for the movement skill. You could use Lightning Warp if you prefer, but that's pretty much the build, I think. I don't think there's anything else to really go over. Yeah, in terms of how it performs against the other builds, it just has, like I said, it has a higher tooltip, and you're guaranteed to pen the boss. So basically, if you're doing things like, if you were to do a map with like Equilibrium and elemental resist on it, and you're attacking a boss, now your curse is less effective. The boss has resist from Equilibrium and resist from the map. So at that point, you may not be able to pen all that resist with some of the other builds that I've done, but this build will take it to 0 regardless. So basically, just like the higher resist you're fighting, the better for this build, because it's going to completely nullify it, and the other builds likely wouldn't have been able to get it below 0. So just something to keep in mind there. But again, stuff that has like very low resist, then those builds are going to take it far negative, and it's going to do probably more damage. The Elementalist, for example, will do more damage. But I think it's very strong so far, and I think especially if you get the Uber points and you can make use of them, this is definitely the highest DPS out of all the builds for sure. So, yep, definitely the one you want to pick if you want to go damage. But if you're going hardcore and you want an easy start, I would probably suggest the Hierophant build. So, and I'll put a link to those in the description. I'll put link to all the builds, all versions of the build in each video guide for each individual build. So that's pretty much it, and thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions or comments or whatever, just feel free to comment on the video, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. And yep, thanks again, and see you next time.